Jumping in, we have zombie dogs. In 1940, the Soviet Union released a 20-minute long motion picture titled Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. Conducted by a Soviet research group who were focusing on the potential resuscitation of dead organisms, the video shows in great length canines being killed and then brought back to life in various different horrifying ways. Now, I love me some doggo, so I'm not gonna lie, this little bit's gonna be a little bit rough. Credited to Dr. Sergei Brukhanoko and Boris Levinskovsky, the video shows several severed dogs' heads that have been kept alive for hours on end. These poor guys were even wiggling their ears still, licking their mouths, and responding to the humans around them. The two scientists claimed that the animals were kept alive by an artificial blood circulation system. Crazily enough, the doctors developed a new version to be used on humans that very same year, and well, no one really knows what happened after that. The doctors went on to be awarded the prestigious Lenin Prize, although some commentators have questioned the film's authenticity, claiming that the severed dog's head only survived for a few minutes when attached to the artificial heart. So, the real story, no one knows, and it's nasty stuff. Coming in at number 4, we've got underwater cities. In the 1960s, the Soviets decided that land just wasn't enough, so they changed things up a bit and headed underwater. By 1966, the Ichthyander project was well underway by a group of amateur divers at their own site in the Crimea. Well, it seemed that in Soviet Russia, anyone could take a pop at experimental science, and that's exactly what happened. And, well, it was pretty much an unrivaled success. That same year, as part of the project, a human being spent 3 days continuously underwater, held in a small metal structure at the bottom of the Black Sea. It picked up some serious hype, and the underwater project soon attracted the attention of the Soviet science authorities. This led to an even bigger push into the experimental field, and in 1967, the project operated an underwater habitat for over 2 weeks. Mysteriously, after that, Project Ichthyander was abruptly dissolved, but records state that the research led to several other Soviet experiments into underwater habitats, such as Sadko, Chernomor, and Sprut. These sites actually exist, so kind of makes you think, are they still down there? Next up at number 3, we have the two-headed dog. Man, here's another rough doggo video, but well, sadly, it seems like man's best friend was the test subject of choice in most early hybrid experimentation. Such is the case with Dr. Vladimir Demikhov. Born in Moscow in 1916, this Soviet scientist dedicated his life's work to what he referred to as transplantology. During the 1930s and 50s, Demikhov went on to pioneer several organ transplantations, such that had never been done before in medical science, such as a heart transplant for an animal and a lung to heart transplant. His most messed up transplantation though, hands down, is his research into dog head transplants, of course, which, well, resulted in a two-headed dog experiment. Insanely enough, the experiment was actually a success, and well, he caught a portion of the result on video. Of course, the test subjects sadly didn't survive very long, but this experiment paved the way for other animal head transplants, such as apes. Dr. Demikhov's true legacy though was to perform human head transplants. No thank you. And swinging in at number 2, we've got man-monkey hybrids. Yep, you heard that correctly. Born in the small town of Shigry, Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov was a Soviet biologist that was the definition of a real-life mad scientist. Now, in reality, Ivanov's research in other fields led to some pretty groundbreaking stuff, particularly in the field of horse breeding. But his main hang-up was that he was absolutely obsessed with making a human-ape hybrid. As early as 1910, Ivanov had given a presentation on his plans for human-ape life to the World Congress of Zoologists in Graz, where he outlined his plans to create this simian hybrid. So, in the 1920s, Ivanov set about his experiments working with human sperm and female chimpanzees. It didn't work though, but Ivanov was determined. So, in 1929, he organized another set of experiments, this time involving ape sperm and human volunteers. The experiments were publicly delayed due to the death of Ivanov's last orangutan, but no one really knows the true outcome of his life's work. In the 1930s, after a political shakeup in the Soviet scientific world, Ivanov was arrested and exiled to Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, where he later died of a stroke. But who knows whether his legacy lives on in the dark corners of the scientific world. And finally, at our number 1 spot, we have Laboratory 1. In 1921, 1991, the Soviet Secret Service, also known as the Cheka, undertook various tests on deadly poisons in an aim to create the perfect biological weapon. In 1939, the small test location was renamed Laboratory 1 and came under the command of notorious Soviet biochemist Grigory Marinovsky. Their objective was the stuff of horrors and set a precedent that would use animals and humans as test subjects to perfect their methods of mass extermination. Marinovsky and his team of scientists would test their poisons on human prisoners from Russian gulags, who they dubbed the so-called enemies of the people. These poisons included mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, and cyanide, and it was given to their victims under the guise of a meal, a drink, or even medication that was meant to help them. Eventually, these vile experiments led to the development of CT/K2, a poison which caused victims to become calm and silent, then eventually die within 15 minutes. Although Marinovsky was arrested by Joseph Stalin as part of a political science shakeup, his horrific legacy lived on, and Laboratory 1 was reportedly reactivated in the late 1990s as part of a biological and toxin weapons project.
Number 5. Robert Liston. I figured I'd start with Robert Liston since he's a bit of an outlier on this list, because unlike the other ones, I don't know if he was truly evil, but he just enjoyed life much differently than the rest of us. You see, Robert Liston was a Scottish surgeon in the 19th century who had a pretty notable reputation. He was the fastest blade in the West End. He boasted that no one could slice and dice faster than he could if the legends about him are to be believed. He was allegedly able to perform a full amputation of a limb in 3 minutes, only losing 1 out of every 10 patients, which honestly, all things considered, is actually a pretty impressive feat, if not an absolutely terrifying one to think about. Liston didn't really have bedside manner to speak of though, and he would take a glee in his work that kind of bordered on sadism. He wasn't a mad scientist plotting world domination, but he was a particularly odd fellow who really reveled in how good he was at removing people's limbs. Everybody's got a hobby, everybody's got something that makes them happy. One particularly grisly anecdote says he once severed a leg in under 30 seconds and gleefully laughed to his crowd of spectators, "Time me, boys!" So evil? I don't know, maybe not. Questionable? Absolutely. Would I hang out with this guy? Probably not while he was working. The issue with Liston is that while he definitely had speed, and no one could argue that, accuracy was not always his strongest suit. Frequently, his rush work would result in his patients having unnecessary complications and conditions such as dying. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Liston has the world's only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. In one occasion, he was working so quickly and carelessly that he amputated his assistant's own fingers off while attempting to sever a leg. And as he was doing this, he swung the knife backwards and ended up hitting a spectator who fainted out of shock. The patient, the assistant, and the spectator all died a few days later, leading to the only surgery that managed to lead to the death of 3 people. That's an impressive record, if nothing else. And my friends, if you'd like to hear more freaky stories, true crime, cryptid sightings, UFO conspiracies, and just about everything scary under the sun and above it, why don't you give Top 5 Scary a subscribe for the best scary content on the net, and keep on screaming. Alright, moving on. Number 4, Jose Delgado. Do you think you could control a bull? I definitely don't. But Jose Delgado believed he could. He was a controversial researcher who believed that the best way to get an animal to behave was not by training it or teaching it a trick and giving it a treat every time it does the trick right, but to implant a series of electrodes into an animal's brain to be able to manually control it with a series of electroshocks. To make a lot of very complicated neuroscience comically short in layman's terms, he was creating remote control monkeys. And do you kind of want one now? Because I kind of want one. Delgado signed on to Yale University sometime in the 1950s, where he set up his little shop in a lab tinkering with all sorts of fun electronic experiments and gizmos to research new methods of control. Oftentimes, it was literally the flip of a switch that would alter the mood of a creature. The thing is, as scary as what he did, the results he was getting were unbelievable, stuff straight out of sci-fi. He was able to train monkeys by stimulating the parts of their brain that would activate aggression, and he would teach them how to manipulate other monkeys that were threatening them by flipping the switches of their aggression. It's nuts. Did you watch Westworld? I know you probably watched the first season at least. I've seen the viewership numbers. You know how in that show they could use those little tablets to open up like a cowboy robot's personality and alter all those stats like aggression, romance, bravery, etc, etc. Well, that's kind of what Delgado was doing, only on chimps instead of Evan Rachel Wood. One controversial experiment involved generating a painful sensation in a chimp's brain every time it produced a particular brain signal, which eventually led to the chimp learning not to think like that. Woof. Delgado's most infamous trial though was the one I mentioned at the beginning, stopping a bull in its tracks. He stood in front of a bull and like the matadors of legend, stared it down and used a shortwave radio and a series of electrodes to freeze it in place. Johnny Knoxville would have loved that. Now despite the controversial nature of his work, which inspired quite a good amount of debate and discussion about ethics, Delgado maintained up until his dying day that the work he was doing was for the benefit of mankind. He wasn't trying to develop mind control, nor did he see his experiments as a way to influence people, but rather he saw his work as a way to overcome mental illness eventually, and cure brain disorders, and also probably save the lives of a lot of bullfighters. Number 3. Giovanni Aldini. So I don't want to spoil too much about this guy right away, but all I'll say is that Giovanni Aldini would end up being the source of inspiration for the character of Victor Frankenstein from Mary Shelley's famous sci-fi novel. So you can probably sort of guess what kind of things this guy was gonna get up to without even having to listen to the next 2 minutes, but I'm sure you're very curious, so I'll explain it to you in great detail anyway. As a young boy, Giovanni was fascinated by his uncle, who was also a physician, and would watch him perform strange experiments. His uncle had an interest in reanimating the dead to see if it was possible to restore vigor to an animal that had passed, and he primarily tested on frogs, where he would attach electrical currents to them. These events, unsurprisingly, would very profoundly affect Giovanni, who sought out to recreate what his uncle had started, only on a much, much bigger target. It's man if you couldn't figure that out by now. As he grew older, Giovanni followed in his uncle's footsteps, zapping frog corpses, moving up to trying to reanimate a bull's head, until ultimately earning his place in mad science history when he started to begin his trials on humans. He sourced his bodies from executed prisoners, thinking, hey, they're done with them, I might as well use them. Trouble was that Italy tended to prefer execution methods that involved the head and the body going in separate directions, although Giovanni made use of this as well. He discovered that with an electric current he could make a patient's face contort, and this was on a head detached from a body. There's a terrifying mental image for you for the day. It was then, when he started sourcing prisoners' bodies from England, that he started to inch closer and closer to that goal of reanimation. He asked for a body as fresh as possible, and he got one George Foster, not the one who played for the Reds though. Attaching probes to this body, astoundingly, he got the man to open an eye, shake his jaw, and seemingly take a breath. This would end up being his last experiment, however, and he deemed the experiment a failure because the thing didn't sprung to life Frankenstein style. Chin up! I bet you'd love to know that your legacy was inspiring one of the most famous horror stories ever about a lunatic doctor who electrifies a corpse. Number 2. Albert Kligman. Now I feel like it bears mentioning before I even talk about all the twisted weird stuff that he did to earn his place in this list of evil scientists that Kligman just sounds like an evil scientist name, does it not? Like if you were writing a movie script, Kligman would be the stand-in name for your evil scientist before you could come up with a better one. Anyway, I digress. Dr. Albert Kligman was a dermatologist who was commissioned by Dow Jones and the US Army to research the effects of chemical compounds on human skin. Oh, yep, this is not going anywhere good. It goes without saying, but like he wasn't checking for Head and Shoulders 3-in-1 conditioner. Kligman was offered a modest lump sum of 10 grand in grant money to research, and he set up shop right away in Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, where he got a near endless supply of test subjects, or victims, to experiment on with very little regard for their safety or hygiene. It was documented that the experiments at Holmesburg Prison included hair transplants, implementation of foreign bodies, burns and radiation of the skin, exposure to dioxin, application and ingestion of toxic and near lethal doses of acne medicine, and the yanking of fingernails. Ugh. I completely understand if you need a moment to just kind of catch yourself. And editors, I'm so sorry for the pictures you guys are looking at for this video. You guys work hard. Alright, let's get back to talking about stomach-churning evil done in the name of science. One of the main compounds Kligman researched that I listed off in that little list before was dioxin, the main ingredient of Agent Orange, the infamously evil chemical weapon the USA used during the Vietnam War. Inmates would be scarred, left sick with permanently disfiguring skin conditions leading to very painful side effects. Oftentimes, times too, many subjects were exposed to all sorts of contaminants and other infections from other conditions he was doing, other experiments he was doing. He did not keep a clean workspace. Kligman destroyed many of the notes from his research, but through testaments from his victims, we know the truth of what he got up to. While there were attempts to get justice after the fact for what the inmates experienced, Kligman himself lived to the age of 93 and never faced any sort of consequences whatsoever for his actions. In fact, the worst part is Kligman loved what he did. Take a listen to this spine-chilling real quote from a real scientist who was really hired by the US Army. "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." That sounds like it's from one of the Saw movies. Are you kidding me? Okay, moving on. Somehow there's a guy who tops this. And finally, number 1, Sidney Gottlieb. Unlike the other scientists on this list, where I would offer a little bit of leeway onto whether or not you could truly consider them to be vile and evil outright, or just, a bit morally flexible in the name of progress, I actually feel very decent taking a stance and saying Sidney Gottlieb was pure evil. Gottlieb was an American chemist and spy master who helmed the CIA's infamous MK Ultra program. Surely, if you've watched even 2 videos featuring me, you have heard me yell like a lunatic about the MK Ultra program. The CIA's very real, very well documented, very traceable mind control program that they were very really researching in the 60s and 70s. And this lovely son of a gun was behind most of it. Gottlieb is about as close to the pop culture definition of an evil scientist as you can get. He believed that there was a way to influence the human mind to ensure global domination for the United States. At the height of the Cold War, the CIA believed that China and Russia had advancements in mind control technology and they needed to catch up. Gottlieb was commissioned to run a series of experiments. Initially, the goal was to develop a truth serum. Gottlieb would experiment with just about every single illegal illicit substance you could on humans, most of the time without them knowing what he was doing. He tested on volunteers, prisoners, homeless, but most often people had no idea the nature of his experiments, and he tended to pick people who had nothing left and had a lot to gain. After months and months of this left him unsatisfied, he was granted extra powers and resources for his experiments, gaining the full funding of the US Army. The goal of MK Ultra was to develop techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point that it would admit anything. Wow. This included torment like electroshock, sensory and sleep deprivation, all kinds of illicit substances, physical and mental damage, and so much more we can't even talk about. Eventually, the program was officially disbanded, citing that it was difficult to control the human psyche in this way. Gottlieb would stick around, however, since he had a real taste for doing evil science, and would helm the CIA's Poison Research Division, looking into just about every way you could conceivably poison a human being, including one infamous poisoned cigar for one Fidel Castro. Gottlieb retired in relative obscurity, never seeing any justice for his work, and lived out his days quietly in Virginia, largely forgotten by history. Well, not by me. Sorry, if you're the real life inspiration for Papa on Stranger Things, you're gonna be the number 1 evil scientist on this list.
Number 5 on this list is the human mouse. Now, how the heck did they manage this one? Popular Mechanics says scientists at the University at Buffalo and the Roswell Park Cancer Institute have bred a new form of human mouse chimera with the highest incidence of human cells ever recorded. 2 weeks after the researchers injected human stem cells into the developing mouse embryos, one of the newborn mice exhibited 4% human cells, a major advance considering human and animal cells don't typically jive well. While they're still mostly just mice and only a tad bit human, the breakthrough marks a step toward more advanced genetically modified embryos in the future. It's not been possible to generate any human stem cells that substantially contribute to mouse embryos, the scientists say in the paper's abstract. Their work may enable applications such as human organ generation in animals. They go on in that article to get very technical with things and break down exactly how they did it, but in all honesty, it got very confusing very quickly to somebody without a science background. The big takeaway here is that there is a mouse out there that is actually 4% human. That mouse, to my knowledge, would be the closest thing in the universe right now to a human being without it being an actual human being. Like, think about that. There is a mouse out there that is kind of like our long lost cousin. This, like everything on this list, starts to get very ethically and morally questionable. At what percent of human does this mouse start to become untouchable? Like, at what point do our laws, rights, and freedoms start to apply to the mouse? 20% human? 30% human? 50%? When does this mouse stop being a mouse and start being a human and start getting treated like a human? And also, what the heck would a 50% mouse and 50% human even look like? Like, we're getting into some seriously weird territory here, and as much as I get that this could be good for science or whatever, I'm pretty sure I can go the rest of my life without ever having to see a half mouse, half human thing. Ugh. Number 4 on this list is the human rabbit. You know, if I had to become a human hybrid of any animal, I feel like a rabbit would be cool. At least then I could jump really high and maybe I could finally dunk. The Washington Post says scientists in China have, for the first time, used cloning techniques to create hybrid embryos that contain a mix of DNA from both humans and rabbits, according to a report in a scientific journal that has reignited the smoldering ethics debate over cloning research. More than 100 of the hybrids made by fusing human skin cells with rabbit eggs were allowed to develop in laboratory dishes for several days before the scientists destroyed them to retrieve so-called embryonic stem cells from their interiors. Although scientists in Massachusetts had previously mixed human cells and cow eggs in a similar attempt to make hybrid embryos as a source of stem cells, those experiments were not successful. Researchers said yesterday they were hopeful that the rabbit work would lead to a new and plentiful source of embryonic stem cells for research and eventually for medical use. But theologians and others decried the work as unethical. Unethical seems to be the theme of this video, folks. That article by the Washington Post was actually written back in 2003. That's right, guys, this happened almost 2 decades ago, meaning that there has been tons of time for them to make better hybrids behind closed doors. Now, I'm not saying that they continued with these projects, but I'm also not saying that they didn't continue either. There was a lot of backlash when this first came out, so continuing with this without people knowing, that might have been desired. Who knows, there could be a fully grown rabbit man hopping around somewhere in some Chinese lab for all we know. Number 3 on this list is the human pig. This is a thing, guys. I really can't believe it is, but this is a literal thing. Stat News says pig embryos that had been injected with human stem cells when they were only a few days old began to grow organs containing human cells, scientists reported on Thursday, an advance that promises or threatens to bring closer the routine production of creatures that are part human and part something else. These human pig chimeras were not allowed to develop past the fetal stage, but the experiment suggests such creations could eventually be used to grow fully human organs for transplant, easing the fatal shortage of organs. 120,000 people in the United States are waiting for life-saving transplants, but every day 2 dozen die before they get them. Human pig chimeras could also be used for research into prenatal development and to test experimental. A human lung in a pig might show more accurately the effect of a compound intended to treat, say, cystic fibrosis than today's lab animals. So they weren't allowed to grow past the fetal stage, but it is coming, guys. All of these human whatever hybrids have been happening in the last couple of years. They're very recent developments, and considering they've shown promise in the early stages, you can bet that this will just continue to keep going and going. I would not be surprised if within 5 or 10 years or so, there's some weird, disgusting looking pig human thing oinking itself around the human hybrid barn. Number 2 on this list is the human monkey. I know that we technically descended from monkeys, but now it looks like we're taking that to a whole other level. Nature.com says scientists have successfully grown monkey embryos containing human cells for the first time, the latest milestone in a rapidly advancing field that has drawn ethical questions. In the work published on the 15th of April in Cell 1, the team injected monkey embryos with human stem cells and watched them develop. They observed human and monkey cells divide and grow together in a dish, with at least 3 embryos surviving to 19 days after fertilization. The overall message is that every embryo contained human cells that proliferate and differentiate to a different extent, says Juan Carlos, a developmental biologist at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies at La Jolla, California, and one of the researchers who led the work. Researchers hope that some human-animal hybrids known as chimeras could provide better models in which to test and be used to grow human organs for transplants. Members of this research team were the first to show in 2019 that they could grow monkey embryos in a dish for up to 20 days after fertilization. So they are literally making these human monkey things and gonna use them as a place to test and other things. No wonder this is bringing up some ethical debates. A half-human is going to be bred to get stuff tested on it and then have its organs harvested. Remind me to not get reincarnated as a human monkey, please. Now, I should note that this is a long way from being finalized, and we are looking at many years until we have human monkeys walking around or being tested upon. But still, it is happening, and they are already finding ways to make it work. Comment down below your feelings on this and whether you think that what they're planning to do is morally right or not. And finally, number 1 on this list is mouse human. So we had human mouse, and this is what I'm calling mouse human. Basically, it's the exact same idea as before, except this time, instead of nondescript human stem cells, they decided to go with human brain cells. Basically, what they've done here is take a mouse and inject some human brain cells into the mouse. This implant has actually shown to make the mice more intelligent than they were before. When referring to what it does to a mouse's brain, one scientist said it's like ramping up the power of your computer. So there guys, it's just like adding a bit more juice to your laptop. Nothing wrong with this picture, nothing to see here. Yeah, alright, Mr. Science Guy. Obviously, as you can all expect by this point, moral and ethical questions have come up about this practice and whether or not it should continue. I think what I want to know is, where are the human brain cells coming from? Are people like donating their brain cells, or how does this work? All I know is that I need to hold on to the ones that I currently have and won't be donating any of my intelligence to a mouse anytime soon.
Number 5, Yang Yongxin. Yang Yongxin is a controversial Chinese clinical psychiatrist, infamous for his practice of trying to treat internet addiction. Well, that almost sounds noble. Now, I definitely spend too much time on Twitter for my own good. What's so evil about getting people to spend more time in the real world? Well, it could be because of his methods, you know? Yang is a firm believer in electroconvulsive therapy, and if you're not familiar with that term, it's a fancy process in which surges of electricity are ran through a patient, inducing a small seizure to treat mental illness. So the way to treat people who are spending too much time on electronic devices is to hook them up to something electronic and let electricity run through their body painfully. Yeah, okay, no, I'm starting to understand where some of this controversy is coming from. Yang believes that people suffering from internet and gaming addiction suffer from personality disorders and need to be treated as such. His clinic doesn't really run like a regular clinic, but has been more closely described as a boot camp. Parents sign away their children into Yang's foster care, who then get sent to a prison-like environment of harsh treatments and cruel conditions. Yang would treat his patients in a military-like manner, punishing them with more treatments for misbehavior, or rewarding patients who would act as informants against other patients. In addition to round-the-clock shockings, Yang would also administer medications to his patients without the consent of them or their parents, by sneaking them in as diet supplements. Yang would punish patients who tried to get their parents to take them home with, well, you can probably take a guess, more shocks. Yang's practice has since been shut down, but in the time it operated, it's estimated that as many as 6,000 patients were exposed to cruel treatments by the doctor. Yang's controversial methods caught him international attention, even in pop culture. The popular multiplayer video game Dead by Daylight, in which players play a monster attacking a team of players trying to survive, featured a character actually inspired by Yang. In 2017, the development studio held a poll for Chinese players on suggestions for a Chinese monster, since the game was very big there. And Yang was a popular write-in vote, as obviously Chinese gamers would see him as a monster, leading the team to create a character who was a doctor who used electricity to shock his opponents. Releasing with him as well was a survivor named Feng Min, an esports pro serving as the doctor's nemesis, an internet-addicted patient, and a map set in a Chinese asylum to boot. Before the final release of the character though, the doctor was changed to an American backstory, presumably to avoid any possible pushback or controversy of comparison to the real doctor. But it's probably saying something if your audience considers you a monster on the level of Michael Myers and Freddy.
Next up at number 4, Dr. Sigmund Rascher. Known for his cruel contributions to the German army in World War II, Sigmund Rascher is among one of the worst scientists in human history. Sigmund's father was also a physician and an avid follower of Rudolf Steiner, an occultist and self-proclaimed clairvoyant. So naturally, Sigmund attended the first Waldorf school based on Rudolf Steiner's philosophies. He went on to study medicine in Munich and later worked for an internship in Switzerland with his father. But despite his upbringing, it seems he grew to align with some other ideologies, eventually joining the German paramilitary organization. And that is where his evil doings would begin. He denounced his father and soon became acquainted with the leader, asking for human subjects to be placed at his disposal. He made it clear the experiments could prove fatal, but that it would be required for accurate results. By 1942, he began conducting experiments in pressure chambers, where he would simulate a high altitude and then quickly alter the pressure to simulate the conditions of a pilot free falling with no oxygen. Allegedly, the leader mentioned that those who survived could be pardoned death at the camp, but Sigmund talked him out of it, stating that they didn't deserve any amnesty. Further, he conducted cruel freezing experiments on 300 prisoners, allegedly to figure out the best way to warm up soldiers who experienced hypothermia. He would either force his victims to remain outdoors completely naked in freezing temperatures for up to 14 hours, or would place them in tanks of ice water for 3 hours, measuring their pulse and internal temperatures all the while. From there, they would try to warm up the victims, usually with water, but experimented using a variety of different temperatures, including boiling, and this would often cause further harm. Along with his other forms of torture under the guise of science, Sigmund would administer polygal, a substance to aid blood clotting, and then shoot or amputate a limb on his victim to see the speed at which they would bleed out. But I will let you know, he eventually did get what was coming to him after years of falsified facts from botched experiments, as well as killing his own lab assistant. Sigmund was executed under the order of the leader, and in 1990 his experiments were ruled inhumane and criminal on top of containing falsified data.
Number 3. Albert Kligman. Right off the top, I just feel like this guy's got an evil scientist name. Kligman just, I don't know, hits the ear wrong. Well, he was guilty of a lot more than a scary sounding name. Dr. Kligman was a dermatologist who was contracted by Dow Corning, Johnson & Johnson, and the US Army to research the effects of chemical compounds on human skin. Being offered a modest 10 grand in grant money, Kligman set out to work right away, finding a bevy of inmates of Philadelphia's Holmesburg Prison, where he would experiment on thousands of inmates with little to no regard for the prisoners' safety or long-term health. It was documented that the experiments at Holmesburg Prison entailed a delightful assortment of things like hair transplants, implantation of foreign bodies, burns and radiation of the skin, exposure to dioxin, application and ingestion of toxic materials, and near lethal doses of acne medicine, and the yanking of fingernails to round it off. Delightful. One of the chemicals Kligman exposed his test subject to that I mentioned earlier, dioxin, was the main contaminant in Agent Orange, the controversial chemical agent used in the Vietnam War by the Americans. Kligman was being paid to research the effects of dioxin on skin, and suffice it to say, it is not pleasant remotely. I hope there's a picture of something disgusting behind me. Inmates would be scarred, left sick, with permanently disfigured skin conditions leading to painful long-term side effects. Oftentimes as well, many subjects were exposed to all sorts of contaminants and other infections from the unsafe conditions of his experiments. Most of his inmates were bribed by financial compensation, ranging anywhere from $30 to $50 for smaller experiments, or $800 for some of the more extreme cases. This small bit of cash was really appealing enough to attract a constant supply of victims, prisoners, who had very little in the way of funds. This allowed them to get a little bit of freedom, a little bit of power within the prison, but also let them have a bit of hope that maybe they'd one day pay off their bail. Kligman destroyed many of the notes from his research, but through testaments from his victims, we know the truth of what he got up to. While there have been many attempts to get justice after the fact for what the inmates experienced, Kligman himself lived to the ripe old age of 93 and never faced any sort of consequences for his actions whatsoever. In fact, he was thrilled by the opportunity. Listen to this quote from Kligman describing how he felt setting up shop at the prison. "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." That sounds made up. That sounds like horror movie bad guy dialogue. That sounds like something Jigsaw would say. But no, it was a real guy who was allowed to experiment on a lot of real people.
Next up is Shiro Ishii. A notorious microbiologist and surgeon during the War of Resistance, a conflict between China and Japan in the 30s and 40s, Shiro Ishii led the development and application of biological warfare for the infamous Unit 731, and is truly an evil scientist if I've ever heard of one. Prior to his evil experiments, he was actually known as a pretty brilliant man. He had a photogenic memory and studied medicine at the Kyoto Imperial University. But despite his highly credible grades, he was not known to get along well with his classmates. During his studies, he was known to grow bacteria in petri dishes and refer to them as his pets, a practice that made many uncomfortable as they felt he was treating the bacteria as more of a companion than a research subject. Potentially the first red flag in what would become a sea of evil and horrendous experiments. By 1927, Ishii was advocating for the creation of a bioweapons program, something that was against the Geneva Convention at the time, but did not yet have enough power within his unit to make it happen. But in 1936, he was promoted to senior army surgeon and given full control over Unit 731, a decision I can only assume is regretted to this day. In these facilities, with no one to tell him no, Ishii decided to unleash his evil experiments on live humans, as he believed he could not get the results he was looking for by testing on animals. Ishii was notorious for injecting his subjects with deadly diseases under the guise of vaccines so that he could watch and study the effects if left untreated, leaving his victims suffering horrifying symptoms and eventually letting them die. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. Victims of his evil experiments would also have limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their bodies, while conscious and without the use of any anesthesia. Or they'd be put into pressure chambers until their eyes literally escaped their skulls. It's estimated that nearly 10,000 people died at the hands of Shiro Ishii's cruel experiments, but perhaps most insane of all is that after the war ended, he was never charged with any war crimes, as he traded the information he obtained in his experiments for immunity and then lived out the remainder of his life in Japan a free man. And last up, we have Harry Harlow. Harry Harlow was an American psychologist during the 30s to the 50s, and although he didn't experiment on people, he is widely regarded as cruel and unethical for his experiments on monkeys. Harlow had one big question: what was the meaning of love? Initially, it started as an earnest study looking at the bond between a mother and her offspring, and early on it did actually provide psychologists with some valuable information about the importance of connection in those early years. But Harlow soon became obsessed and began blurring the lines of ethical experimentation until soon he was nothing more than a monster. What was once about discovering the importance of early stage bonding morphed into long-term isolation and the mental effects it had on the monkeys. Harlow and his team had what they literally called the pits of despair, I kid you not, where the test subjects would be isolated without any contact, including the smells and sounds of other monkeys, for up to a year. The results of his experiment were severely damaged monkeys who, as he described, were obliterated socially. After being released from isolation, many refused to eat, and some ended up dying from starvation. Autopsies would show the monkeys were actively choosing not to eat, causing some to believe that he had actually driven the animals to such bad mental states that they no longer wanted to be alive. Over the years, he got the name monkey torturer, as on top of extended isolation, he would also actually force the monkeys to mate using an archaic device. However, because he was conducting such experiments prior to the Animal Welfare Act of 1966, not only did he not face any repercussions, he was actually awarded for his findings and highly celebrated among many in his industry. This doesn't mean he went uncriticized for his unethical treatment. Some of the students that worked in Harlow's unit at the university have come forward saying that they had nightmares of the experiments being conducted and couldn't wait until he retired to shut down the entire operation. Others said that anybody with respect for life would find this offensive, and all he left was one huge mess to clean up. Later, Harlow went on to say in a 1974 interview, I don't really like animals. I despise cats, I hate dogs. How could you like a monkey? So, despite looking for the meaning of love, it seems he was more interested in torturing innocent monkeys and causing irreversible harm.
Number 5 on this list is the humanzee. The humanzee, as you can imagine, is a human mixed with a chimpanzee. This is a very interesting entry on this list because whether or not it has actually been created or not is up for debate. Science Alert says a prominent US scientist has claimed researchers in Florida succeeded in breeding a human-chimp hybrid called a humanzee in controversial, long-rumored 1920s research. Evolutionary psychologist Gordon G. Gallup Jr., who achieved renown for his pioneering mirror self-recognition experiments with animals in the 1970s, says a former university professor told him the hybrid creature was born at an animal research laboratory where he once worked. One of the most interesting cases involved an attempt which was made back in the 1920s in what was the first primate research center established in the US in Orange Park, Florida, Gallup told The Sun. They inseminated a female chimpanzee with human semen from an undisclosed donor and claimed not only that pregnancy occurred, but the pregnancy went full term and resulted in a live birth. There's little reason to think such an experiment successfully took place, and plenty of reasons to believe it didn't. But having an otherwise respected researcher make such a statement is drawing attention to this old rumor once again. It's definitely interesting to see a highly respected scientist in the community come out and make these claims like this. That does tend to carry a decent amount of weight and at the very least deserves to be investigated a little bit. It was also rumored that a few years ago some people came forward requesting government approval to do an experiment like this, but it was denied. So there's definitely been rumblings about an experiment like this before, but no definitive proof that it's actually taken place. To be completely honest, I do believe that something like this has went down. I just think that it may have happened behind closed doors, and we may not be privy to it. Like, this totally seems like something that the government could be interested in, but wouldn't want the public to find out about. Maybe in some secret base in some very low population part of the world, there is a humanzee running around getting experimented on. Number 4 on this list is the human pig. So as we are going to see from this one, there are a lot of possible benefits from this, but also a ton of moral and ethical questions that pop up. Pagista says the first human-pig hybrid embryo has been created in the lab, and it represents a major step forward in the field of regenerative medicine. This news comes from a team of researchers at the Salk Institute who were able to successfully grow human cells inside of a pig embryo for the first time ever. While this may sound like something out of a science fiction novel, the potential implications are actually quite significant. This achievement could one day lead to the creation of transplant organs for humans that are made from animal tissue. This would be an incredible breakthrough for those suffering from organ failure, as there would no longer need to be a wait for a human donor. Of course, there is still a long way to go before this technology is ready for clinical use. The next step will be to see if these hybrid embryos can develop into healthy adults. But even if that proves to be possible, it will be many years before we see anything like this being used in patients. So here is the thing with this. Yes, it would be awesome to be able to have a steady supply of usable organs to give to people who are suffering or need another one. So many people die from not having enough transplantable organs, and this is a problem that needs to be addressed. However, this also raises the question, what about the human pigs? These are going to be half-human creatures that are going to be bred for the specific purpose of having their organs harvested. This is clearly a very polarizing issue and something that people a lot smarter than me, they need to look into. Comment down below what you think about this potential innovation and how you think we should proceed. Number 3 on this list is the jag lion. Now, in all honesty, this is more cool than it is terrifying, but I still wanted to include at least one relatively cool thing on the list. Also too, if you did run into this thing in the wild, then I can promise you it would be very scary. So I think it still qualifies. Pagista says a jag-lion hybrid is a cross between a male jaguar and a female lion. The result is an animal with characteristics of both parent species, although it's usually more similar to the lion in appearance. Jag lions are not currently found in the wild, but several have been born in captivity. The jag lion was first created in 2006 when a male jaguar named Elvis was bred with a female lion named Lola at the Exceptional Animal Park located in Phoenix, Arizona, USA. The two big cats mated successfully, and Lola gave birth to 6 healthy jag lion cubs. Since then, several other jag lions have been born in zoos around the world. These hybrids are not only interesting to look at, they also help scientists to learn more about the genetics of both lions and jaguars. So, like I said, this thing is really cool, but could also be very scary depending on where and how you run into it. In the zoo, where there's a large protective piece of glass between the two of you, not very scary at all. Totally cool. In the jungle, where there is no protective glass and this creature is very hungry, not cool, very scary. Good thing that there really isn't any of these creatures at the wild at the moment, so running into one outside of captivity would be very, very hard, but you never know. Number 2 on this list is the wolfen, breeding one of the most intelligent creatures with one of the deadliest. Sounds like a great idea. That's what happened here with the wolfen. Pagista says weird hybrid experiments usually make for interesting reading, and the wolfen is no different. This unusual creature is actually a cross between a false killer whale and an Atlantic bottlenose dolphin, and was first discovered back in 1985. Since then, there have been several documented cases of wolfens in the wild, and even a few captive ones as well. While they share many characteristics with both of their parent species, there are some notable differences that make the wolfen truly unique. For one, they are typically smaller than either false killer whales or bottlenose dolphins, with an average length of just over 6 feet. They also have a more slender build, and their flippers are shorter in proportion to their body than either parent species. Interestingly, wolfens also seem to exhibit social behaviors that are more similar to dolphins than whales. They are often seen forming close bonds with other members of their pod and engaging in activities such as surfing and playfully chasing each other around. It would be very rare to spot this creature in the wild, but be very careful if you do. Dolphins are super smart, and killer whales, well, they're killers. This is one of the most intelligent and also deadliest animals in the ocean, and therefore you need to tread carefully around it. And finally, number 1 on this list is the human mouse. The human mouse is another one of those ones with potential positives, but also lots of ethical questions. Pagista says in a first of its kind study, scientists have created a mouse embryo that contains human cells. The research published in the journal Nature could eventually lead to the development of new treatments for diseases using stem cells. To create the hybrid embryo, the researchers injected human stem cells into a mouse embryo. The human cells then began to grow and form structures that are found in the human brain and heart. The researchers say that the human cells were able to survive and grow because they were surrounded by mouse cells. This suggests that it may be possible to create hybrid embryos that contain a mix of human and animal cells. The study is still in its early stages, and it remains to be seen whether these hybrid embryos will be able to develop into healthy animals. However, the findings suggest that it may be one day possible to use stem cells from patients with diseases to create customized treatments. So yeah, again, tons of possible benefits for people who are going through some rough treatments right now, but also we're gonna have a mouse that's almost as smart as us humans acting as a test dummy for us. This is uncharted territory for humans, and understanding exactly how to go about it, it's something that we're gonna need to discover along the way.
Number 5, the monster study. Wow, right into it, huh? Great name for it and all. The monster study was a terrifying and triggering speech and stuttering experiment that took place in 1939. Performed on 22 orphans and conducted by Wendell Johnson, the professor of speech and pathology at the University of Iowa. Half of the people received positive speech therapy, praising the fluency of their speech. I just watched King's Speech with Colin Firth, and let me tell you, yeah, it's nothing like that, no. that had a happy ending with metaphors and lessons interwoven. This is just science being cruel. Because the other half, the negative speech therapy, which includes belittling the subjects for speech imperfections, yeah, just straight up chirping at people suffering a lifetime of obvious emotional stress already, and of course, retaining that stress and speech difficulty for the remainder of their life. It was dubbed the Monster Study, as some of Johnson's peers were absolutely pissed and horrified that he would experiment on orphanage subjects at such a tender age in development to confirm his hypothesis. Yeah, sick stuff, dude, really? Basically, good reinforcement meant fast learning. You ever been yelled at by a parent while doing math? Yeah, it's horrible. On top of everything, the experiment was kept hidden for fear Johnson's reputation would be tarnished in the wake of human experiments conducted during the war. You think? The results were actually never published, and his thesis is the only official record of the details. Apparently, the university apologized in 2001, but the university assistant professor of speech pathology said the data collected from the experiment is unfortunately the largest collection of scientific information on stuttering that we have, and that Johnson's work was the first to discuss the importance of the thoughts and beliefs and feelings of the actual individual struggling. Number 4, multiple births. The 1960s were a dark time for medicine. Clinical psychiatrist Peter Neubauer and a couple of professors at Yale University thought it'd be a good idea to persuade Louise Wise Services, an adoption agency, to send twins and triplets to completely different homes without telling the adoptive parents, and they were adopting a child who was of another sibling. And neither did the biological parents, of course. Whoa, what? Yeah, that's not cool. I can see angry mama bears right now just clawing at the screen. Apparently, researchers sponsored by Children's Services secretly compared their research and progress in now what is called the infamous twins study. The research was never completed, but what was left behind was the unethical treatment and trauma of separating individuals at birth. That didn't end, apparently, in New York until the 1980s. In 1990, a decade after the confidential study, Neubauer and the Child Development Center of the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services arranged to actually house the locked records at Yale University. The Jewish Board set terms that gave the organization power to approve or deny any requests to access the records for the next 75 years. In 2018, apparently a couple thousand pages were released to the public, but of course, like all things intending to be silent, the pages were heavily redacted. Yeah, lots of sharpieing. Yo, this is absolutely terrifying, okay? Like, what did they find in that study? Also, so sad. There's been a couple documentaries now covering this study and focusing on the trauma it's caused to those who again begged to gain access to their own files. In 2011, apparently the Jewish Board denied 2 separate twins the request to access their own sealed records. So what exactly happened that made these scientists so secretive of their work? Number 3, Stanford Prison. The Stanford Prison experiment was a psychological experiment conducted in the summer of 1971. Pretty standard university experiment. A 2-week simulation of a prison environment that examined the effects of situational variables on participants. Yeah, what could go wrong, right? Well, we just heard how when it comes to university studies, the law all of a sudden becomes this imaginary thing. Stanford University psychology professor Philip Zimbardo led this research study. Participants were recruited from the local ad in a local school newspaper engineered by the research team, offering only male participants $15 per day for those to participate in a fun study looking at prison life. Haha, yeehaw! People were handpicked after psych assessments, then randomly assigned roles of either prisoner or guard. Like a giant game of cops and robbers, right? The guards were given uniforms and instructed to prevent prisoners from escaping. No rules. The experiment officially started when prisoners were booked by real Palo Alto police, and over the next 5 days, psychological abuse by the guards became more and more sadistic. The experiment was actually forced to end on the 6th day. Let's just say it got so violent, it's known as one of the most unethical psychological experiments in history. The harm and abuse inflicted on the participants prompted universities worldwide to improve their own ethics departments, and experiments were then severely reevaluated by the educational board before they began. This was an example of use of power, the barbarism of humans, the sick experimental boundaries those are risking to put others through for career-breaking research. Scary stuff. Number 1. Jose Delgado. Rodriguez Delgado's research was cutting edge for his time. It was centered on the use of electrical signals to invoke responses in the brain. This is like way before Neuralink and scientists were trying to microchip us for like Interac and stuff. It was the early 40s. A dark time for medicine. Famed for his research on mind control through electrical stimulation of the brain. His earliest work was actually with cats, but of course, if you haven't guessed, he later experimented with monkeys and then, eventually, humans. Specifically, psychiatric patients. Delgado's work was centered around a certain invention he coined the stimoceiver, a radio which joined the stimulator of brainwaves with a receiver. This allowed the subject of an experiment full freedom of movement while allowing the experimenter to control the experimentee. Very sci-fi for the time, you know? Basically the math behind putting a giant antenna in your head, but it's inside your head. The stimoceiver was used to simulate emotions and control the person's behavior. Stimulation on different points in the amygdala in 4 patients produced a variety of effects including deep concentration, odd feelings, and colorful visions. Okay, no, not so bad so far. Delgado could not only elicit emotions, he could also elicit tons of movement. Yeah, we're talking Weekend at Bernie's type movement, but subtle at first, like a limb or the clenching of a fist, then bigger limbs and more movement. Basically, this guy was driving you via your brain. Mad scientist or the pioneer of electric brain stimulation? Maybe you can be both.
Number 5. Jose Delgado, the mad mind controller. One of the more common mad scientist tropes is the desire to develop devices or formulas that will allow the scientist to control people's minds. The idea of so completely and irreversibly being under someone's control sounds so outlandish that many would be forgiven for writing such stories off as pure science fiction. However, not only have scientists made several attempts at this over the years, one made a frightening amount of progress. Enter Dr. Jose Manuel Rodriguez Delgado, who was one such scientist. Delgado spent years constructing a device that he called the stimoceiver, which was designed to allow him to control the minds of both animals and men. While doing research at Yale University, Delgado inserted electrode implants into the skulls and brains of several primates. He then used a remote-controlled device which paired with the implants and stimulated them with electricity, allowing him to force the primates to perform complicated movements. He also performed this experiment on a bull, who he got into the ring with. When the bull charged him, he used the device to cause the bull to stop at his will. Delgado hooked up 25 people to his device, and though he couldn't make them move how he wanted to, he was able to control the people's aggression levels. This was not enough for Delgado, as he wanted to achieve total control, once being quoted as saying, "Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. This kind of liberal orientation has great appeal. We must electrically control the brain. Someday, armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulations to the brain. I don't know about you, but wishing to create an army of mind-controlled soldiers is taking it too far." Number 3. Vladimir Demikhov, the dog grafter. One of the more recent and disturbing fictional mad scientists to hit the silver screen is the one featured in The Human Centipede, who plans to sew 3 people together in order to create a new living co-joined creature that all share one digestive system. While explaining this to his victims, the scientist shows photos and refers to a previous experiment where he managed to sew 3 Rottweilers together. While this is disgusting, it is unfortunately not without precedent in real life. Though the mouth placement was thankfully not the same, it does share some similarities to the work of a real-life Soviet scientist, Vladimir Demikhov. Vladimir was a pioneer in the field of organ transplantation, and some of his groundbreaking work involved performing the transfer of vital organs between dogs. This was vital for the scientific and medical community's understanding of organ transplants, and has resulted in millions of lives being saved. But the work he moved on to in the 50s is when he took the whole thing too far. He decided that he wanted to take the entire thing further by creating a 2-headed dog. He and his assistants attempted the experiment at least 24 times, with the 24th 24th being the one that was most widely publicized, and the closest that anyone could really call a success. The operation took 3.5 hours, and by its conclusion, both of the dogs were still able to see, smell, and swallow. Although Shavka had no digestive system, and whatever she ate or drank simply exited her body via a tube that Vladimir had implanted. While one of his previous attempts had apparently survived a whole month, these two dogs mercifully lasted a much shorter amount of time, passing away 4 days after the surgery due to a nicked vein. Photos of the surgically connected dogs were published in Life magazine, and they are truly ghastly to behold. While this is bizarre, it was also needlessly cruel, as it had little to no scientific benefit, and the scientist had no end goal in mind when he did it, other than wondering if it was possible. Number 2. Fritz Haber, Dr. Poison. The German-born chemist Fritz Haber has a somewhat mixed legacy in the scientific community. On the one hand, his invention of the Weber-Bosch process allowed people to use nitrogen and hydrogen gas to synthesize ammonia, which was extremely important for the creation of large-scale fertilization. In fact, this Nobel Prize-winning method is used in 1/3 of all global food production, which feeds almost 50% of the world's population. Basically, without him, it would be impossible to feed as many of the people of Earth as we do. On the other hand, he was also a fierce German nationalist, and when the First World War broke out, he pioneered the development and usage of chlorine and other poisonous gases, to be used to break the deadlocks the Germans had been experiencing in trench warfare of the First World War. When asked about the moral implications of his work, he was quoted as saying, "Death is death by whatever means it is inflicted." Someone who felt he had gone too far with his creation was his wife, who after the first use of weaponized chlorine gas in 1915 walked into their garden with his old service pistol and ended her own life in protest. As a Jewish man, Haber was forced to resign his post when the Third Reich came to power in 1933. But his work on poison gases was still used by the Germans in the death camps in order to exterminate their prisoners. Fritz Haber changed the world with his first discovery, allowing us to feed millions of people who might otherwise have starved. But due to the prolific work on poison gases, he is more commonly remembered as the father of chemical warfare. Number 1. Shiro Ishii, the Professor of Pain. In World War II, Shiro Ishii was a member of Imperial Japan's Medical Corps who became inspired to pursue truly horrendous methods of germ warfare. Due to his status as an esteemed scientist and general, he was placed in charge of the Japanese government's bio and chemical warfare unit, known as Unit 71, despite the fact that the Geneva Convention had banned such means in 1925. Ishii insisted that the only way that Unit 71 could make meaningful scientific progress was to use civilians as test subjects. Men and women and children were subjected to Ishii's brutal experiments, which were written off as necessary acts in order to bolster the Japanese army and discover potential weaknesses in their enemies by discovering just how much the human body could handle before collapsing. While some prisoners were purposely infected with diseases before having their organs removed so Ishii could study the effects of the illness on the organs without having to factor in decomposition, others were intentionally given gangrene or frostbite, and some were vivisected while still alive, while others had limbs amputated and then reattached to the opposite sides. While he was far from the only person conducting cruel and unusual experiments on prisoners during the Second World War, the case could be made that he was the most insane of them. There is little doubt that he went leagues too far, with his methods not even coming close to being justified by their ends. I sometimes think that my imprisonment here in the dark dimension is some kind of experiment to study the depths of spiritual torment one can endure.
Number 5 on this list is the Aviator suit. Back in the early 1900s, flight was on everyone's mind. Flying machines were extremely new and were not very well developed, but scientists wanted to push it further. In this case, the specific scientist in question is Franz Reichelt. Franz Reichelt was designing an aviator suit. This aviator suit is just a fancy name for what we now consider to be a parachute. He folded up a fabric that was roughly 320 square feet and made it into a wearable aviator suit. The idea was exactly what we have now for a parachute. You jump into the air from a high height and then your parachute comes out and you should gently float to the ground. This is great in theory, but it didn't work out that great in practice. Franz had tried his device from the roof of a few buildings, but it never worked. He claimed that it wasn't his invention that was the problem, but the height of the building. So, naturally, we just needed to try it from a higher building. Enter in the Eiffel Tower. Now, up until this point, he was using test dummies to jump off the buildings, and he was all set to do that again for the Eiffel Tower, but last minute, he got a change of heart. Franz was feeling that performance adrenaline and wanted to show off his invention to the crowd below, so he strapped into his suit and leaped off the Eiffel Tower himself. He beautifully floated down to the ground in a picturesque fashion to the sound of crowds cheering and chanting his name. Is what he wanted to happen. What actually happened is that he jumped off, the suit didn't work, and he fell all the way to the ground from the Eiffel Tower. Believe it or not, the landing didn't actually kill him though. He was already dead. Franz had a heart attack before he hit the ground when he realized his suit wasn't gonna work. Number 4 on this list is Australia's mustard gas experiment. One would think that testing a deadly poisonous gas on people would be kind of a silly and dangerous thing to do, but that's exactly what happened in this science experiment. Top 10s writes, Queensland, Australia set the stage for some awful chemical weapons testing on human subjects. The year 1942 brought Australia into the thick of World War II. Hostilities when Japanese aggression brought more questions than answers about how mustard gas might behave and deliver harm in a tropical climate. The chemical weapon had already been deployed against China by Japan, sparking fears that Australia was next in line. To investigate, human experiments using a gas chamber which was moved from Townsville, Australia to Melbourne on a 3-ton truck were conducted. The trouble is, the danger of mustard gas exposure was underestimated. Over the 3 years to follow, a range of secret tests were done. The research included gas chamber tests involving volunteers who were Australian Armed Forces recruits who apparently did not fully understand the degree of potential harm to which they were getting themselves into. The tropical conditions quadrupled the effects of mustard gas, leaving many with nasty injuries. At Innisfall, volunteers tested how long they could carry on their duties while exposed to burning mustard gas, while 1944 experiments on Northbrook Island saw volunteers dropping into trenches after the island was doused with the deadly substance. Imagine literally joining the army to help your country fight, and then your own country, who you've decided to risk your life for, uses you as a test dummy with mustard gas. These were new recruits who had no idea what was going on, but were just trying to help their country, and then bam! Australia drops a bunch of mustard gas on them and wonders why a lot of them got permanently injured. This one was one of two things. It was either pure stupidity from the Australian government, or it was pure cruelty. Both are bad considering these are the people who run the country making these decisions. Either way, as you can all imagine, the experiment proved that mustard gas is still very dangerous. Number 3 on this list is Frankenstein. Alright, so I know, Frankenstein is a fictional experiment and everything else on this list actually happened, but when it comes to science experiments going wrong, Frankenstein has kind of definitely set the mark here. Frankenstein is the classic novel written by Mary Shelley back in 1818, where a young scientist named Victor Frankenstein decides to organize a science experiment that goes horribly wrong. Well, initially, the experiment actually goes horribly right. We all know the classic line, "It's alive," because the experiment did actually work and the monster did actually come alive. There have been multiple adaptations of this story over the years, with some stories talking about how this monster attacked the village below and incited a mob, but in the original story, the monster actually strangled Victor's future wife. Attacking a village, strangling Victor's lover, neither of these outcomes are good, so ultimately I think it's safe to say that this experiment didn't go as planned. Number 2 on this list is the Stanford Prison experiment. This was a psychological science experiment that is often considered one of the worst in history. The study was done in 1971 and was meant to be a 2-week simulation of prison. It was run by Stanford professor Philip Zimbardo and went horribly wrong. Wikipedia says participants were recruited from the local community with an ad in the newspapers offering $15 per day to male students who wanted to participate in a psychological study of prison life. Volunteers were chosen after assessments of psychological stability and then randomly assigned to being prisoners or prison guards. Critics have questioned the validity of these methods. Those volunteers selected to be guards were given uniforms specifically to de-individuate them and instructed to prevent prisoners from escaping. The experiment officially started when prisoners were arrested by real Palo Alto police. Over the following 5 days, psychological abuse on the prisoners by the guards became increasingly brutal. After Christina Maslach visited to evaluate the conditions, she was so upset to see how study participants were behaving that she confronted Zimbardo. He ended the experiment on the 6th day. Like the Milgram experiment, SPE has been referenced and critiqued as one of the most unethical psychology experiments in history. The harm inflicted on the participants prompted universities worldwide to improve their ethics requirements for human subject experiments. Other researchers have found it difficult to reproduce the study, especially given those constraints. It truly was extremely brutal, and the fact that it went on for as long as it did is kind of crazy. Many of the people that participated here had long-lasting effects, and this incident changed their lives forever. All for $15 a day, just so this sick professor could see that prison ultimately really sucks. And finally, number 1 on this list is Unit 731. Unit 731 was absolutely terrifying and not a group that you wanted to be associated with at all. Basically, this was a group that conducted multiple science experiments on civilians. They were around from the 1930s to the 1940s in the Japanese army. They were led by General Shiro Ishii and were responsible for killing potentially over 200,000 people. These deaths were sometimes purposeful, but mainly they were just a byproduct of the horrible experiments that they were performing. Live Science says numerous diseases were studied in order to determine their potential use in warfare. Among them were plague, anthrax, dysentery, typhoid, paratyphoid, and chlorora, according to a paper by Dr. Robert K.D. Peterson for Montana University. Numerous atrocities were committed, including infecting wells with cholera and typhoid and spreading plague-ridden fleas across Chinese cities. According to Peterson, the fleas were dropped in clay bombs, which were dropped at a height of 200 to 300 meters and showed no trace. Prisoners were marched in freezing weather and then experimented on to determine the best treatment for frostbite. Former members of the unit have told media outlets that prisoners were doused with poison gas, put in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out, and even dissected while alive and conscious. After the war, the US government helped keep the experiment secret as part of a plan to make Japan a Cold War ally, according to the Times report. They were terrible experiments that often failed and resulted in the loss of human life. These experiments were honestly doomed from the beginning and were destined to go horribly wrong.
Coming in at number 5, we have chainsaw. Do you know why the chainsaw was invented? If you don't, then this might surprise you. Surprisingly, the chainsaw was not invented for cutting down trees or any type of manual work. It was actually invented to help with childbirth. And by help, it was more of an unnecessary torture, making a painful experience much, much worse. 2 Scottish doctors, John Aitken and James Jeffrey, invented the tool in the 1780s. Before the caesarean section was common practice, all babies had to pass through the birth canal. When the baby became stuck or breached, the doctor would remove the parts of the pelvis bone. This was medically known as symphysiotomy. This was a painful and messy procedure that was performed without any anesthesia. The doctors complained that the procedure took a long time as they had to remove the bone by hand. They invented a small chainsaw to make the procedure faster for them to perform, but still incredibly painful. For women, the procedure had a high risk of infection, injury, and even long-term walking difficulty. It could ruin their lives, as well as the high risks already associated with childbirth from that time. In the 20th century, the use of this procedure became obsolete when improvements in hygiene and technique made the caesarean section much safer. It wasn't until the 1920s that the chainsaw began to be developed for use in forestry work. Coming in at number 3, we have Guatemala syphilis experiments. The Guatemala syphilis experiments were United States-led human experiments conducted from 1946 to 1948, although I'm sure the effects of this experiment lasted far past that. The experiments were led by a doctor named Charles Cutler. The idea for the study was to infect soldiers, prisoners, and mentally ill patients with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. The worst part about this was that none of the participants were aware that they were even part of the study. The United States wanted to see the effects that the disease would have on our participants over a long period of time. There were at least 30 documented deaths due to the experiment, but that number could be much higher. These diseases can cause infertility, blindness, it can make you paralyzed, and even cause dementia. There is a long list of horrible things that were inflicted on these people that would have affected them and future generations for years following. The experiments were uncovered in 2005 2005 while someone was researching into studies around it. It wasn't until 2010 when the US government formally apologized for their actions. They admitted to violating human rights and that committing the study was a crime against humanity. There have since been a number of lawsuits filed against the US government for what they did to the community. People want answers as to why and how this could have happened. What makes this worse is that this was not the first study of its kind conducted by the US Public Health Study. They did the exact same thing in 1932 to Tuskegee. 600 sharecroppers were found and hired in Alabama. Again, none of them were told they had been given the disease. They were only told they'd be given free healthcare, meals, and burial insurance. Even after penicillin was proven to cure the disease, the study continued until 1972, 25 years after the cure was found. In addition to the original subjects, the victims of the trial passed the disease onto their wives and their children were born with it also. They tried to cover up both trials, but Bill Clinton formally apologized in 1997 to those affected after it had been uncovered. Coming in at number 2, we have experimentation in the Soviet Union. In 1921, the Soviet Union started to do human experimentation. They built 2 laboratories for experiments with poison called Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, and Chimera. They wanted these studies to be covert so that they would be able to use it against their enemies. They would take prisoners from the forced labor camps called the Gulag and bring them to the facilities. While there, they would give them a meal. It would be poisoned, but they would not be told this. They would first see if they noticed the smell or taste of the poison, and then they would examine the body to see if there were any trace of it in their system. Their goal was to find the perfect poison, one that didn't have a smell or taste and that could not be detected post-mortem. Over the time of the experiments, they tested poisons including mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, and cura. They continued their experiments for most of the 21st century.
Moving on to number 4, the mustard gas experiments. During World War I, one of the most startling innovations was the gas that German soldiers had released on the Allies. It was a new kind of chemical warfare that was unprecedented, and the Allied forces were unprepared for it. Eventually, masks were developed and improved upon to help soldiers survive the gas bombings. Flash forward to 1943. Mustard gas was anticipated as being a major problem during the Second World War, and the US Navy began testing the effectiveness of new clothing and gas masks that were meant to protect their men from its threat. But these experiments that they did were pretty unethical. Young men who were aged 17 to 18 were brought in after boot camp as participants in an experiment that they were told was to help shorten the war. When they actually arrived at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, they found out that it had to do with mustard gas, and that they were going to be exposed to it, many of which later then suffered internal and external burns. After the experiments were done, the Navy pretty much ignored what had happened, and even threatened some of these men with the Espionage Act. During the experiments themselves, if the men protested, they were threatened with an immediate court-martial and 40 years in prison. In 1991, the files about the experiments were declassified and taken to Congress. The worst part was, the experiments were pretty much for nothing. The Allies only used mustard gas once in World War II, and it was by accident, resulting in over 1,000 civilian casualties. Next up at number 2, Unit 731. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese armies during World War II. The unit participated in lethal human experimentation and operated under the official name, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Approximately 3,000 men, women, and children who were war prisoners were experimented on, being euphemistically referred to as logs, with the experiments ranging from vivisection, which is surgery conducted on living organism, that involved injecting prisoners with various diseases and removing organs, germ warfare attacks, frostbite testing, syphilis testing, rape and forced pregnancy experiments, and weapon testing. Most of the prisoners were Chinese, but prisoners also consisted of European, Soviet, American, Korean, and Australian prisoners of war.